You know, the official story we keep hearing about the U.S. economy is all about its incredible resilience, but there's a second story. It's a quieter one, hiding in plain sight on bank statements and credit card bills all across the country. And that story, it's all about debt.
$18.6 trillion. As of the end of 2025, that is the record-smashing amount of debt held by American households. It's a number so huge it's hard to even wrap your head around, almost abstract. But for millions and millions of people, the story that number tells is very, very real.
So that's the big question, right? If the economy is growing, if things look okay on the surface, should we even be worried about this mountain of debt? Is it a warning sign of a crisis to come, or is it just the cost of doing business in the world's biggest economy? Let's unpack that.
Okay, so to really get what's happening here, you have to look at two totally different stories that are playing out at the exact same time. You've got the big picture view of the national economy, and then you've got the reality of what's actually happening in the average person's wallet. First up, let's look at that official story. From a 30,000-foot view, a lot of economists see a U.S. economy that's done surprisingly well, weathering high interest rates and inflation way better than expected. Consumer spending, which is really the engine of our whole economy, has stayed pretty strong. In fact, if you look at analysts from places like Morgan Stanley, they see a surprisingly smooth road ahead. They're forecasting that inflation will keep cooling down, which could give central banks room to actually cut interest rates. And they're pointing to strong consumer spending and massive investments in things like AI as these huge engines for growth. So the big picture? It looks, well, pretty stable. But here's the twist. This is where those two stories collide. While that big picture looks stable, the household picture shows a really critical detail. All this economic activity is being paid for with a record amount of borrowing. And that right there is the central tension we need to wrap our heads around. So, let's break down that massive number. Where exactly is this $18.6 trillion of debt coming from? I'll give you a hint. It's not all from late-night online shopping sprees. Okay, so where is it all coming from? Well, the vast majority, a full 70%, is tied up in mortgages. Housing is the bedrock of American wealth, sure, but it's also our single biggest liability. The rest is a mix of student loans, auto loans, and of course credit cards, each one a little piece of the American dream, and each one with a price tag that just keeps going up.
Look, taking on debt isn't automatically a bad thing, right? But it becomes a huge problem when people can't pay it back. And lately, we've started to see some really serious warning signs, flashing red, you could say, that suggest the burden is just becoming too heavy for a lot of people.
Let's start with auto loans. The rate of people who are seriously behind on their car payments, and that means being more than 90 days late, has just hit a 15-year high. It's pretty simple. Higher car prices plus higher interest rates are pushing more and more people over the edge.
And it's a very similar story with credit cards. I mean, with average interest rates now soaring above 22%, just carrying a balance has become incredibly expensive. And what's the result? Serious delinquencies are getting close to levels we haven't seen in over a decade.
And then you have student loans. After that pandemic-era payment pause finally ended, delinquencies just surged. We're now at the highest rate ever recorded. For millions of borrowers, having to restart those payments on top of inflation and everything else just proved to be impossible.
And this really gets to the absolute heart of the problem, and it's captured perfectly by Maria Bowers over at KPMG. She says the cost of servicing debt has risen faster than incomes for most households. It's a simple but absolutely brutal equation that explains exactly why so many people are falling behind.
So who's actually feeling this squeeze the most? Because this financial pressure isn't being felt equally. Different generations, different income levels, they're all experiencing this debt dilemma in very, very different ways.
So you've got Generation X, kind of caught in the middle, paying for their kids' college while also trying to save for retirement. They carry the highest average debt. But the real story here might actually be Gen Z. As they're just starting to finance their adult lives, their debt levels jump by nearly 8% in just 1 year. That's the fastest of any generation.
And speaking of student loans, check out this statistic. It's genuinely surprising. You'd probably think it's mostly recent grads who are falling behind, but nope, you'd be wrong. The data actually shows the majority of new delinquencies are among borrowers over the age of 50. Many of them likely co-sign loans for their kids.
You know, this whole story is about so much more than just interest rates and balance sheets.
For the millions of people living under the weight of all this debt, there is a very real and often very hidden human cost.
It leads to something that experts call the debt mental health cycle, and it is a vicious, awful trap. See, the stress of constantly worrying about money can cause serious mental health challenges like anxiety and depression. But then, when you're struggling with those conditions, it becomes incredibly difficult to manage your finances, which, you guessed it, makes the debt even worse.
The impacts are just profound. We're talking about prolonged stress, poor sleep, and an inability to concentrate. And because so many people feel ashamed or embarrassed about their debt, they're often really reluctant to ask for help. So they just suffer in silence while the problem gets bigger and bigger.
So let's circle all the way back to our original question. We have these two competing stories, right? A resilient national economy on one side and deeply, deeply stressed households on the other. Which one's going to win out? What happens next?
So what does the future hold? Well, experts basically see three ways this could all play out. On the bright side, strong spending could just keep on going. Or maybe a huge boom in AI productivity could supercharge growth. But there's also a much more worrying path, a mild recession, where the sheer weight of all this debt finally catches up to us and the economy actually starts to shrink. The truth is, nobody knows for sure.
And that leaves us with one final, absolutely critical question. Consumer spending powers a staggering 2/3 of the entire U.S. economy. For years now, that spending has been propped up by more and more borrowing. So, what happens to the economy when the credit cards are finally maxed out and the loans come due? What happens when the borrowing has to stop?